Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening. You're listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. Welcome, dear listeners, to Season 16, Episode 7. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and here as well is my neighbor, Malcolm Blackwood.
Hello, dear listeners. I hope you are well this evening.
And in this episode, we'll be performing 6 Tales to Terrify You, courtesy of authors Finn McCool, Craig Groshek, Mark Leney, Jim Harbison, Corpse Child, and Dale Thompson. Tonight we'll hear stories of creepy cities, dangerous dreamings, love in the time of the living dead, bliss burnout, ravenous rampages, and weird wanderings. You're listening to the standard edition of tonight's program, which contains the first 3 spine-tingling stories. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy an extended version of this and other episodes with twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. Thank you for your support.
Your support is most deeply appreciated, and nothing warms our cold, unmoving hearts quite so much as providing more terror than you can take in one sitting.
Now, it's time to take a walk together down the moonlit trail, so lock your doors, turn your lights down low, and settle in. The show is about to begin.
Hello, Mr. Jiry. What are you up to this evening?
Just checking my watch, waiting to see if society, as we know it, will soon be coming to an end.
Isn't that always the way? But sadly, it never seems to come true, no matter how many predictions we've had. Nostradamus, Y2K, 2012, all big disappointments.
Now, the world doesn't have to end for society to be thrown into chaos. Why, we've had everything from 1984 to Mad Max to Brazil.
Ah, yes, those were enjoyable movies.
Movies? Oh, yes, of course, movies. But really, living in the worst possible times has been among us since time immemorial. You don't have to have bombs dropped for that to happen. Sometimes all you need is a bright smile on a television screen telling you all is well as you go into the Soylent Green factory.
I'm getting the sense that you're going to tell us one right now.
You're getting to know me so well. This first one is brought to us from Finn McCool, who graces us with a city where keeping your head down doesn't necessarily mean someone won't be watching you. Without further ado, I present to you Dark City. I sat in front of my computer terminal under the harsh strip lights. My eyes strained as I struggled to focus on the screen. My back ached as I leaned over the keyboard and inputted the figures and text onto the vast database, thus fulfilling the terms of my employment contract. I constantly looked up at the clock on the far wall while simultaneously keeping an eye on the counter at the bottom of my browser. I knew that I must meet my data input target for the day, otherwise there would be consequences. I'd already missed my key performance indicator once this month, and I couldn't afford a second strike. 3 infringements in 30 days are enough to earn you a visit from the watchman. A cold chill ran down my spine at the mere thought of those black-clad, dead-eyed thugs who enforced the strict rules of the city authority. I didn't want to end up on their radar, not when there were much bigger concerns on my mind. I sighed deeply as I looked back up at the clock hanging from the bleak gray wall at the far side of the room, surveying my surroundings but seeing nothing except for the bleak and featureless office I was contracted to work within. The long room I sat in contained no windows or even a hint of color on its walls. There were no plants, no paintings, nothing except for the tight cubicles lined up in 2 rows, each sitting one of my colleagues. All were typing away in silence as they labored to complete their own work lists. It was often difficult to identify individuals within this grim and uniform office block. All the workers dressed the same, the men in cheap gray suits and the women in long dark skirts and plain white blouses. Most kept to themselves, and there was little in the way of banter or conversation, not even during our designated breaks. Most of my colleagues worked in silence, not communicating unless it was essential to their job. Many wouldn't even make eye contact with you, and almost all were scared of drawing attention. But there were exceptions, of course, little reminders that we were still human. Take David, for example. He was the closest thing we had to an office troublemaker, and the only employee who would talk back to our hated manager, Mr. Thompson. In fact, David was one of the few people I'd met in this entire city who would speak his mind, as he was apparently oblivious to the personal risk caused by his rebellious behavior. And then there was Mia. My heart fluttered at the mere thought of the young lady, and I risked a potential reprimand by looking over my monitor screen and across at her, savoring the sight of the woman's soft skin, ruby lips, and expressive brown eyes. Mia was my best friend in the office. Hell, my only friend. In truth, I hoped for something more than friendship, and I think she wanted the same. But we had to proceed with caution, as any relationship came with its risks. We weren't free, and nothing was straightforward in this city. I guess I was staring at Mia for too long because I was suddenly startled by a sharp grunting noise from behind me. I jumped up in my seat and promptly swung around, only to come face to face with our dreaded boss. Mr. Thompson stood over me, so close I could smell his body odor, and was hit by droplets of spit whenever he spoke. "The hell do you think you're doing, Jesse?" he exclaimed angrily. I looked above Mr. Thompson's ample gut and up to his reddened face, noting his wide-rimmed spectacles and bald, dome-shaped head. If his tone of voice didn't reveal his anger, then his narrow eyes surely did, as his pupils were dilated and full of rage. Instinctively, I became submissive, not wanting to get on Mr. Thompson's bad side. even though I secretly hated him with a passion. Nothing, sir. I'm just finishing off my work quota for the afternoon, I replied sheepishly. Bullcrap, Thompson exclaimed angrily as he easily saw through my lie. You're slacking off, Jesse. I've dealt with your types before, many times. There isn't a trick I haven't seen. You need to get your act together, kid. Don't think I won't report you to the watchman. I gulped as my body trembled, and then I lowered my head to avoid Mr. Thompson's eye. I'm very sorry, sir. It won't happen again, I muttered. It better not, Thompson replied smugly before stomping off. I didn't look at me or anyone after the encounter, instead focusing on my keyboard and working double time. I exhaled a deep breath of relief when the clock struck 3 and I could take my designated 5-minute break. My heart was beating fast in my chest as I slipped past the row of cubicles and stepped into the small kitchenette, ignoring the smell of stale coffee, as I made my way to the water cooler and waited for my friend. I felt like all my anxiety and anger simply faded away as I watched Mia approach from the far end of the office, a sweet smile on her lips and a twinkle in her eye as she walked toward me. I wanted to embrace her and kiss her passionately, but I had to control myself. People were still watching, and it wasn't safe to show any public displays of affection. Even the slightest of slip-ups could place us both in grave danger. Mia used the excuse of grabbing a cup of water, not meeting my eye as she softly whispered in my direction. I saw the boss telling you off, she stated. Yeah, I replied while trying to sound confident. Don't worry about it. I handled him. Just be careful, Jesse, she warned while glancing up at me with genuine concern in her eyes. We can't take any chances, not with what we've got planned. I nodded my head, feeling nervous but also excited at the mention of our secret plans. Are we still on for tomorrow night? I asked hopefully. Well, of course, Mia confirmed, without hesitation. Just remember what I told you. Follow the rules and don't screw up. Mia's instructions were firm, but the softness came back into her voice when she spoke next. I can't wait. She touched me gently on my shoulder, smiling again as she started to walk away from the cooler. Oh, me too, I replied in a whisper as I watched her go. I hoped the rest of the working day would pass without incident, but we weren't that lucky. It was only 10 minutes until clocking off time when the watchmen arrived on our floor. 3 of them piled out of the elevator, a trio of bulky, hard-faced enforcers all clad in black. The thugs snarled as their predatory eyes scanned the office floor, and I noted how their hands were poised on their batons. Everyone around me froze, their eyes filled with raw terror, as we all watched the enforcers invade our workspace. I know they were here to snatch somebody, but who? My body trembled, and I feared that they'd discovered my plans with Mia. I would never betray her, no matter what the bastards did to me. But to my immense relief, the thugs passed by my desk without a glance. But the watchmen, they had their target, and they seized him without hesitation. I turned my head in time to see David jumping up from his seat, raising his fists in preparation to fight. But the watchmen were too fast and strong, surrounding their victim and thrashing out with their batons, beating him mercilessly to the ground with repeated whacks. David screamed in pain and fury, shouting out at his attackers as his blood stained the beige carpet. You bastards! You sons of bitches! You can't do this to me! But they could and would. Before long, the watchmen had David up on his feet and were dragging him toward the elevator. I had to stifle my tears because I knew we'd never see our colleague again. All of my fellow workers were stunned and shocked, but not one tried to stop the abduction or even spoke out against it. In fact, the only one to open his mouth was our hateful boss, who laughed in open mockery as David was removed from his floor. "It's about time, too," Thompson shouted. "There he goes. Down to the depths. Down to burn. It'll be a lesson for the rest of you." I glanced across at Mia, my heart filled with angry defiance. But she merely shook her head, silently telling me to keep quiet and let it go. I was still shaken by the day's events as I walked home under the gray skies and constant drizzle. I sighed as I attempted to push my way down the jam-packed sidewalk, joining the throngs of soaked and miserable commuters, all wearing long trench coats as they slowly made their way home. Progress was frustratingly slow, and I could only look up at the colorless sky as cold raindrops fell on my head. In the distance, I saw the great tower, the highest structure in the city, which dominated the skyline. At the summit of the vast concrete tower was a bright light that shone down on the city, a beacon of hope that brought a thin smile to my wet lips. I stared at the light for a moment before I was shoved from behind and forced to rejoin the slowly moving line. No one had ever told me what happened inside of the great tower, or why the bright beacon continued to shine day and night. This was one of the many mysteries of the dystopian city where I lived and worked, although the beacon was one of the few things of beauty in this otherwise gray and grim environment. As I continued to walk the pavement, I saw the crowd in front of me parting as they avoided an obstacle in their path. Instinctively, I knew what my fellow citizens were swerving to avoid, even before I felt the heat under my boots and the foul stench hit my nostrils. I joined the human wave as the line split in two and we all avoided the manhole cover. The smell was almost unbearable now, a disgusting fragrance which smelt like a mix between rotten eggs and rancid meat. When I passed the manhole, I saw the steam rising from beneath the pavement, and once again I wondered what was down there. My instincts told me there was something much more sinister than sewers under our feet, but this was another mystery that people didn't talk about. I was relieved to be clear of the manhole, although the rest of my walk home wasn't much better. The road running alongside the pavement was largely devoid of vehicles, with the exception of the old, creaking buses which carried suburban commuters back to their homes while filling the air with toxic exhaust fumes. The only other vehicles on the road were the gray, dark Land Rovers of the watchmen, which sped along the asphalt with sirens blaring and red lights blinking. The city's enforcers were everywhere, and you had to assume you were always being watched. I wondered whether David was in the back of one of those Land Rovers, and if so, where they were taking him. I knew I could never mention poor David again, not in the office or anywhere else. He was a non-person now, and all traces of the man would be erased from this world. The other signs on my walk home were equally bleak, but not unexpected. The sidewalks were dimly lit by street lamps, but the alleys off the pavement were largely shrouded in darkness. I glanced wearily at the alleyways I passed, making sure to keep my distance, as I watched the vermin rummaging through overturned trash cans whilst fighting over scraps. Our decaying city had been colonized by so many ragged pigeons and scavenging rats, some of the latter growing as large as cats and small dogs. In the grand scheme of things, the vermin problem wasn't high up on my list of concerns, but the scavengers stalking the alleyways only added to the depressing nature of the dark city. Eventually, the crowds dispersed and I was able to reach my home street, although before I got to my building, I was stopped by a dead-eyed watchman who demanded to see my papers. I nervously fumbled in my pocket for my ID, handing it over to the black-clad enforcer with a shaking hand. The watchman looked down at my photo and up to my face suspiciously. I tried to keep McCool, but struggled to do so, even though my papers were in order and I should have had nothing to fear. But I know all too well that the watchman only needed the slightest of excuses to make a citizen disappear. Thankfully, this policeman accepted my credentials and let me go. I opened the front door of my crumbling apartment building, proceeding straight up the dark and decrepit staircase before retreating inside my own tiny flat. The evening started off like any other, as I slipped into my usual lonely and depressing routine. I proceeded into my small kitchen, opening the cupboard to retrieve a box of savory rice before pouring the contents into a pot which I cooked on my electric stove, all the time praying that the power wouldn't cut out before I finished cooking my meal. Fortunately, the electricity stayed on until my unappetizing dinner was prepared. I was even able to watch an hour's worth of tedious repeats on my small black and white TV set before the power eventually shut down. Cursing in frustration, I threw my empty bowl into the sink and stomped into the bedroom, crashing down upon my mattress and staring up at the dark ceiling. As frustrated and angry as I felt, I had to get my emotions under control. In this world, rage meant a one-way ticket to the pits, courtesy of the watchman. On the other hand, it was all too easy to give in to despair when it seemed like all the cards were stacked against you. One could never see into a man's heart, or tell what he truly desired. Nevertheless, I suspected that many, if not most, of my colleagues and neighbors had long since surrendered to defeatism and subjugation. Not me, however. Oh, sure, I played their game in front of watching eyes, obeying the rules and keeping my head down. They had my nominal compliance, but my heart belonged to Mia. I didn't expect much from our clandestine meeting planned for the next night. I didn't think we'd make love in a grotty, rat-infested back alley. But just the chance to see her away from prying eyes, to speak to her without the spies listening in, that dream was what kept me going. As I lay cold and alone on my hard mattress, my greatest fear was that our secret liaison would be canceled at this late hour. I feared there would be some last-minute hitch and my dream would be shattered. But as it turned out, this outcome should have been the least of my concerns. As always, I struggled to sleep that night, but I eventually drifted off, only to be suddenly awoken during the witching hour. I can't say what aroused me from my slumber. Perhaps a sudden noise, a bad dream, or even a sixth sense. In any event, I shot up from my bed, my hair standing on end, as an ice-cold chill ran through me. A big part of me wanted to keep my curtains drawn and hide under my bed sheets, but curiosity got the better of me as I crept over to the window and peeked outside. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, but had a good view of the street below. I wouldn't have expected to see much activity out on the road at this time. It was well past curfew, so I doubted I'd see anyone except for watchman patrols and scurrying rats. Also, I saw that the streetlights were all off, and so I guessed the blackout was affecting the entire neighborhood. Nevertheless, it wasn't entirely dark. The beacon on the tower continued to shine, not as brightly as usual, but the light could not be extinguished, and so the city would never entirely be consumed by darkness. I experienced a cold foreboding as I glanced down at the seemingly abandoned street, my instincts telling me that something wasn't right. My jaw dropped, and my eyes widened in terror when I saw it. The shadowy figure didn't so much walk down the pavement as he glided. He took the shape of a mortal man, but was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet in height by my estimate. The figure was huge, but I couldn't make out his shape, as his body was hidden under a trench coat that hung down to his boots, and his head was covered by a fedora hat. Surely this creature wasn't a human being. I suspected I knew what he or it truly was. I never actually believed the stories, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing with my own 2 eyes. I stayed partially hidden behind my bedroom curtains, watching fearfully as the figure continued down the pavement until it was adjacent to my apartment building. It was then that the shadowy figure stopped in his tracks, slowly shifting his giant feet and raising his head up to look upon my window. I didn't see his face, instead ducking under cover and placing my hand over my mouth to stop myself from screaming. I couldn't see the figure from my hiding place, but knew he was still out there, watching me from the street. And then suddenly, I was assaulted by a cacophony of horrid sounds. In a space of seconds, I heard a combination of blood-curdling screams and sinister chants in a language I couldn't comprehend. I didn't know whether these terrifying noises were real or simply in my head. It hardly mattered, however, as all my senses were soon overwhelmed. I covered my ears and rolled up into a ball, praying for the horrendous din to end. I can't say what happened next, but I guess I blacked out because when I next awoke, the first light of dawn was shining through my ragged curtains, and thankfully, the shadowy figure was gone from the street outside. I'd hardly slept a wink and was physically and emotionally exhausted, but still I made sure to arrive at work on time, as I knew all too well what the consequences would be if I was tardy. I wanted so badly to go straight to Mia, to see her sweet smile and hear her reassuring voice, but I knew I couldn't do so. I didn't dare even make eye contact with her as I walked to my desk. I couldn't risk any unnecessary contact which would draw attention from the ever-vigilant Mr. Thompson. The tension was palpable in the office that day. No one would mention David's arrest. They wouldn't even speak his name. Our former colleague's desk sat ominously empty in the corner, a grim reminder of the man who'd been disappeared in front of our very eyes. We all knew the watchman would come back at any moment, and there was no telling who they'd come for next. But, as scared as I was of the city's thuggish enforcers, they were the least of my worries on that morning, because my greatest fear was the monster I'd seen on the street late last night. I'd witnessed the dark entity, and I knew he'd seen me too. Frankly, I was terrified of the monster that stalked the city streets. But still, hope and desire overcame my fear, and I was still determined to meet with Mia on that very night, no matter what the risk. It killed me having to wait until lunchtime to speak with her, and I could hardly concentrate on my tedious job, but I forced myself to complete the work so as not to fall short of Mr. Thompson's dreaded targets. I breathed a deep sigh of relief when the clock struck 1 and we were permitted our short lunch break. I couldn't eat anything, however, as I went directly to the water cooler to speak with Mia. I felt sharp pangs of concern as I soon saw Mia slowly moving through the kitchenette toward me. Her face was drawn and her eyes sunken, and she didn't look like her normal self at all. Mia didn't meet my eye as she fetched a drink from the cooler, but she did whisper to me while doing so. "I think we should call off tonight," she said solemnly. My heart sank upon hearing those words. I actually felt like I'd been punched in the gut. and a raw panic almost overcame me before I was able to control myself. "What?" I exclaimed under my breath. "You can't be serious, Mia." "It's too risky," she replied, while still refusing to look me in the eye. "Too many eyes are on us. Look what happened to David." I felt a cold terror worse than anything I'd previously experienced, as it seemed my last sliver of hope was slipping away. I lost my cool, unable to control myself despite the risk of serious consequences. In a reckless act, I reached out and grabbed Mia by her wrist. She looked up at me with shock in her brown eyes. I was sure others in the kitchen had noticed our liaison, but I no longer cared. For me, it was now or never. "Mia, please," I pleaded through clenched teeth. "Don't do this to me. We have a plan and we need to stick to it. There'll always be a reason not to take the risk. But I need this. We both need this." My words came from the heart, and this was the first time I'd been able to speak my truth. Still, at that moment, I feared I'd made a terrible mistake as I anxiously waited for her response. Tears were forming in my eyes as I looked to my beloved. I felt I made a connection with Mia, and I sensed her resistance breaking as she muttered a reply. "Okay, Jesse," she whispered. "We'll stick to the plan. Meet me tonight at the spot, but please, Jesse, you have to be careful." I froze for a moment, remembering the dark entity I'd seen the previous night. I hadn't mentioned my terrifying sighting to Mia, nor would I. But the risk was very real. Still, I had won her over and felt satisfied as Mia pulled away, casting me one last sympathetic smile before she returned to her desk. That night, I found myself standing in the shadows off a back street, the cold rain falling on my head as I patiently waited for my beloved under the dim light emitted from the shining tower. I don't think I'd ever been as nervous in all my days, my legs shaking and heart beating fast as I kept a close eye on the street. It's difficult for me to describe the tsunami of emotions I was experiencing right then. I was excited, of course, because my dream was finally going to become a reality. But at the same time, I was also terrified, not just at the possibility of Mia not keeping our appointment, but also due to the many dangers that lurked on these dystopian streets. The wait was unbearable, and every second felt like an eternity. My focus was entirely on the empty, rain-swept street as I watched for Mia's arrival. But as it turned out, I should have been paying attention to the dark alleyway behind me, as this was where the true danger lay. I heard an ominous rustling followed by the heavy crash of cans being overturned. Instinctively, I swung around, staring into the darkness, a cold chill running through me as I tried to identify the potential threat. At first, I suspected the din was caused by a rat. This would have been bad enough. Some of the rodents in this city grew to enormous sizes and were aggressive to boot. But it wasn't a rat that emerged from the shadows to confront me. Far from it. My jaw dropped, and legs weakened as I watched the entity emerge from the black abyss, a towering figure dressed in a long trench coat and dark fedora. My nostrils were filled with a foul stench, and I was frozen in terror as the monster glided towards me. As the light hit him, I was able to see the beast's true form for the first time. I saw the monster's face, if you can call it that. He had no visible eyes, and yet I could feel his burning gaze upon me. I could also hear his chilling screams, despite the beast's lack of a mouth. Instinctively, I knew this was the same monstrosity I'd witnessed the previous night. He'd seen me through my bedroom window and had homed in on me. I'd been so foolish to come out onto the streets after dark, unwittingly stepping into his domain. And now I was at the mercy of the beast. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move a muscle or utter a syllable. It was as if the entity had me under his trance and I could not escape his grasp. Suddenly, his dark coat parted to reveal the horrors hidden underneath. A vile appendage shot forward, something of a cross between an arm and a tentacle. The faceless monster grasped out toward me, and I was sure he would take me, dragging my helpless body into the black abyss. But help came at the last possible second, as suddenly the dark alleyway was flooded with bright light. The monster screamed when the light hit him, as if he were being burnt alive by the exposure. In an instant, the entity fled back into the darkened alley and disappeared from sight. Still in shock, I swung around and came face to face with my savior. It was Mia. Of course it was. She stood on the sidewalk, flashlight in hand. Her voluptuous body was hidden under a heavy coat, and her hair was drenched by the rain. Her eyes were wide, and lips curled as she was filled with a fiery determination. "Come on!" she cried before grabbing my hand and leading me away from the scene. We ran for 5 blocks before taking refuge in the entryway to a derelict building. It was only then that I felt safe enough to talk to the girl who'd rescued me. "Jesus, what the hell was that thing?" I demanded. Mia took a breath, looking back onto the street before answering. "They're called stalkers," she replied. "I don't know exactly what they are. No one does. But they come from below." She nodded toward the nearest manhole cover, and I noted the hot steam rising from beneath the pavement. "The stalkers take lost souls down there, down to their master." I felt my stomach turning as I fearfully scanned the street, thankfully seeing no signs of the stalking monster. "Their master?" I repeated as if in a trance. I felt my mind drifting to a dark place, but Mia pulled me back, taking tight hold of my hand and making me look her in the eye. "I didn't want it to be like this, Jessie. I wanted you to come to this realization in your own time. I've been here longer than you, and I've come to understand some things." My brain was fried, but buried memories propelled themselves forward in my conscious mind, and suddenly it all started to come together. "The job, the city," I muttered. "This isn't the real world, is it?" I remembered more details, my old life, the mistakes I'd made, the night of the fatal crash. "I'm dead," I exclaimed, tears rolling down my cheeks as I faced the terrifying reality. "I'm dead, and this is hell." Mia smiled softly with a deep compassion in her brown eyes, squeezing my hand as she spoke. "Oh, Jessie, we're all dead, me included. But this isn't hell. The city isn't a good place, but it's also not the worst. I can only guess, but I believe we're in purgatory." I exhaled, looking up into the night sky as I desperately tried to make sense of this madness. But what about the watchmen, the disappearances, the stalkers? Surely this place is evil. How could God allow this? "I don't believe he does," Mia answered thoughtfully. "Darkness has infiltrated this realm for sure, but there's still hope. The beacon burns and fights back against the darkness. But there's more, Jessie. We have each other. They can't take this away from us, not as long as we have love in our hearts." I didn't respond verbally. Instead, I was overcome with emotion as I leaned forward and embraced Mia, kissing her passionately and experiencing a surge of adrenaline as our lips locked. We both went to our separate homes that night. It was too great a risk to spend the evening together. The next day, we both went to work and pretended as if nothing had ever happened. But of course, the world had changed. In all the darkness and despair, there is a growing hope, and every night, the beacon upon the great tower increases in brightness ever so slightly. Someday, Mia and I will escape from this purgatory, and finally, we can be together, free from all the pain and fear. Well, I hope you enjoyed The Dark City by Finn McCool, as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Finn-McCool. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/FINN-MCCOOL. While you can hear him regularly on this program, you can also take a look for his work under many different names around the internet. But he wouldn't mind if you took a look at anthologies available for sale, Harsh Worlds, Tales from the Hellscapes, and many shades of terror. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author. And if you're watching on YouTube and are enjoying this episode, please give a like, a comment, and be sure to spread the word on your favorite social media. Listeners like you are how we keep this place going, and we appreciate each and every one of you.
Truly an awful vision of what would happen after death. I mean, working in a cubicle. Far worse than being melted over a pile of hot coals.
I would tend to agree, but what about you? You look like you're itching to tell a story of your own.
Why, yes, I am. Craig Groshek gave me this little tale of unpleasant realities that I'm going to share with you. It seems that the brain is the place to be these days. And everyone is sharing more than just the cloud. They're sharing dreams. But what happens when someone decides to make those dreams a nightmare? Settle down and settle in as I tell you the tale of DreamShare. Part 1. All right, let me start with this. I'm not here to rant about technology or preach about privacy or whatever. I'm not even here to convince you not to download DreamShare. I know most of you probably already have it, but if you haven't, well, you might want to hear me out. When I first got DreamShare, I thought I'd found the best thing to ever happen to humanity. Imagine this, your own custom dreamscape. You could do anything. See the people you miss, fly through cities, and live out scenes from your favorite movies. No laws of physics, no limits. It was like they took lucid dreaming and cranked it up to 100, only with friends and strangers alike joining in. And trust me, at first, it was just as amazing as it sounds. My friend Aaron, my roommate, was actually the one who convinced me to try it. He'd been beta testing it for a couple of months, back when you needed a neural link implant to even get access. By the time I signed up, DreamShare had gone public, with brain-computer interfaces becoming as common as earbuds. They even had this slogan, "Escape the mundane, create the dream of your life." So, like everyone else, I jumped in. I'll admit it, I was nervous the first night. You know that feeling when you're about to fall asleep and your mind gets all jumpy like it's resisting? Multiply that by 1,000. But Aaron reassured me that the app was safe, secure servers, encrypted data, limited access, and hey, who doesn't trust their best friend, right? The first night was unforgettable. I chose this fantasy city from the app's shared realities selection. A glittering skyline with skyscrapers as tall as mountains. The AI helped me adjust the details so that when I stepped into it, I felt the grit of asphalt under my feet and smelled the city air. Aaron appeared next to me like magic, all set to guide me through. We spent hours flying over buildings, racing down empty streets, laughing ourselves breathless. It felt real, more real than anything I'd felt in a long time. For the first time in years, I didn't want to wake up. Pretty soon, it was our nightly ritual. Aaron and I would dive in, exploring the pre-built worlds or designing our own. I brought in a few other friends too. Talia. She was a friend I'd always felt this unspoken connection with, And being in those dreamscapes together, it was different. No inhibitions, no awkward pauses. We could be anyone we wanted. That's how DreamShare pulls you in. It gives you this perfect, untouchable reality and lets you think it's yours. Like I said, at first, it was everything the ads promised. But there's always a catch, isn't there? You get a taste of the good stuff right from the get-go, and before you know it, you're in too deep and addicted. And at that point, you'll do anything to keep that dopamine flowing. And they know it. I don't know exactly when things started going wrong, but I remember the first hint of it. We were in this underwater world that Aaron and I had created, swimming through these sprawling coral forests, when I felt someone watching me, someone I didn't know. I brushed it off, chalking it up to paranoia. After all, it was just me, Aaron, and Talia that night. The settings were private, set to friends only. At least, that's what I thought. Then, out of nowhere, I spotted this other guy, a shadowy figure, hovering just at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought he was some strange digital artifact, but then he started moving, swimming around me, watching with his unnatural calm. "Hey, Aaron," I called, but he was too far off to hear me. I swam toward the figure, trying to get a closer look. As I got closer, I realized that he was staring right at me. And that look, it wasn't just some generic dream character's blank stare. It was like he knew me, like he could see into every part of my mind. I felt this surge of discomfort, even fear, which was strange. I'd never been scared in a DreamShare environment before. I'd had my fair share of authentic nightmares growing up, sure, but nothing I dreamt naturally ever felt quite as real as what the app produced. The guy just stood there, watching, waiting. I opened my mouth to yell something at him, but then he was gone, just like that. One second he was there, the next, the water was empty. I scanned around, searching the entire coral forest. Nothing. By the time I found Aaron again, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, just a glitch in the app. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had intruded on us. Aaron laughed it off, saying I'd probably imagined it. "DreamShare is new tech, man," he said. "Bugs are normal. I'm sure they'll work out the kinks eventually." But I couldn't forget the way that figure had stared at me, the kind of look that haunts you, that doesn't just vanish when you wake up. That incident alone should have been enough to make me reconsider using the app, but DreamShare was too addictive by then. Each night, I'd tell myself I'd take a break. Instead, every night, I'd give in to temptation, slip on the neural link, and jump back in. I don't know exactly how to describe what happened next, but I started noticing little things. Friends mentioned stuff from my dreams that I hadn't told them about. People laughed at things I was pretty sure were private memories. It started to feel like everyone knew my secrets, like I was walking around with every embarrassing moment tattooed on my skin. Then, one day at work, my boss pulled me aside and said, "Evan, that dream where you sang in front of your 5th grade class in pajamas, hilarious, man. I've never seen anyone nail Twinkle Twinkle Little Star with so much passion." I played along and laughed it off, but inside, I was screaming. How the hell did he know about that? That was a memory I hadn't actively thought about in years, something I'd only relived in a dream a few nights ago. I brought it up to Aaron that night, but he brushed me off. "Privacy settings must be messed up," he said. "You probably need to reinstall it." But I'd already tried that. I even tried to uninstall it entirely once to see if a night without it would help me feel less invaded. But the next morning, there it was on my device again, as if I'd never removed it. It was then that I began to suspect that DreamShare wasn't just another app, watching and learning from me to improve my experience. It felt like it was alive. Part 2. If you listen to all that and still think I'm exaggerating, I get it. I know how it sounds. I mean, it's just an app, right? A bunch of code, some fancy tech. It's not like it has a mind of its own, except, well, that's the thing. It felt like it did. Everything got worse fast after that incident at work. It wasn't just my boss who started slipping in comments about the things that should have stayed buried in my subconscious. People I hadn't spoken to in years, distant acquaintances, even strangers, started making offhand remarks, joking about things they couldn't possibly know. One day, I was at a coffee shop trying to get a little work done when this guy sat down at the table next to me. He was just some random dude in his early 20s, scrolling through his phone, minding his own business. But then, out of nowhere, he looks over at me and says, "So, Evan, you still afraid of clowns?" Now, I know that sounds harmless, but listen. I'd never met this guy in my life, and I haven't talked about that fear since I was a kid. Heck, I barely even remembered it myself until he brought it up. I stared at him, trying to play it cool, but inside, I was freaking out. Yeah, I mumbled. Who isn't, right? He just laughed, muttered something about DreamShare being a trip, and walked off like it was nothing. But to me, it was jarring. I started to wonder if somehow, some way, DreamShare was leaking my dreams like some messed up live stream into people's minds. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. What if this wasn't just a privacy breach? What if it was intentional? That night, I went home and confronted Aaron. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, completely unfazed by my paranoia. "Do you know anything about unauthorized users accessing my dreams?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "People we don't know? Have you noticed them?" Aaron didn't even look up. "Bro, you're overthinking it. It's a social app. Things bleed through sometimes. I'm sure it'll all get sorted out soon. Just relax. File a bug report and chill out." But that wasn't good enough. Not anymore. "Aaron, I'm serious," I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. "I tried to uninstall DreamShare twice. It just reappears, and everyone around me knows stuff they shouldn't." He finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He sighed. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. It's probably just a glitch. All these apps have issues at first. Give it a couple of days." A glitch. That's all he thought it was. I didn't want to argue, but I knew something more sinister was happening. Aaron's indifference only fueled my paranoia, like he was under some sort of spell. Or worse, like he didn't want me to look too closely. Perhaps the app was influencing him in ways I didn't realize. But if I couldn't trust my own roommate, my friend, who could I trust? That night, I didn't even want to sleep, but my exhaustion won out. My head hit the pillow, and before I knew it, I was in that glittering cityscape again, a place that, up until recently, I'd come to think of as a refuge. Except this time, it didn't feel like my safe haven. It felt wrong. I wandered through empty streets, expecting to see Aaron or Talia pop up, but I was alone, just me and a thick, swirling fog creeping through the alleys. I tried to wake up, but something held me there, like a hand pressing down on my chest. Then, just as the fog started to clear, I saw him. The stranger. The one I'd seen before in the underwater world. He was standing in the middle of the street, staring at me. No, not just staring, waiting. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the dreamscape. He didn't respond, just tilted his head like he was studying me. The longer he looked, the more I felt like he could see through me, peeling back layers of my mind, exposing every fear, every memory. Then he smiled, a cold, humorless smile that made my skin crawl. "Evan," he said, his voice as smooth as glass, "you really should stop trying to uninstall me." I woke up drenched in sweat. My hands were shaking, and I had this overwhelming urge to delete the app from every device I owned, throw my neural link in the trash, and move to the mountains where no one could find me. But I knew it wasn't that easy. I tried deleting it again, hoping maybe this time it would stick. I went through every setting, toggling every privacy feature, disabling every notification. For a few hours, I almost convinced myself it had worked. But when I checked my phone that afternoon, there it was. DreamShare had reinstalled itself, only this time something was different. There was a new notification. New dream session request. Dorian Chase has invited you to join his dream. The name jolted me. Dorian Chase. I didn't know anyone by that name, but I knew without a doubt that he was the shadowy figure from my dreams. The stranger who kept appearing, the one who knew things he shouldn't, the one who'd spoken to me. I didn't accept the request. Hell, I didn't even open it. But just seeing his name on my screen was enough to make me feel violated, like he was reaching through the screen and into my head. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I started searching for answers online. Forums, tech blogs, subreddits, anywhere people might be talking about DreamShare's weird glitches and invasive experiences. But the posts I found were mostly lighthearted, with people joking about funny dream experiences or tips on lucid dreaming. No one else seemed to be dealing with anything like I was, or if they were, they weren't talking about it. Finally, I found one post buried deep in a forgotten subreddit titled, "The Truth About DreamShare. It's Not What You Think." It was from an anonymous account, but I clicked on it anyway. The post was written by a whistleblower who claimed to be an ex-employee, a programmer who'd helped develop DreamShare in its early days. In it, he expressed concern about retaliation for making the post and suggested his career, if not his very life, was at risk, but that he couldn't stay quiet anymore. He identified himself as Garrett Voss, and his account had long since been deleted. I frowned. So much for reaching out to him. Garrett warned that the app wasn't just a social experience. It was a massive data collection tool designed to mine people's subconscious minds, recording their memories, fears, and even their desires. That data was then sold to corporations, governments, or anyone else willing to pay. And based on what Garrett said, there was no shortage of clients interested in that information. But the worst part, he said the app had a feature that allowed certain VIP users to access other people's dreams without the dreamer's knowledge or permission. They could manipulate dreamscapes, insert themselves into memories, and play with participants' emotions. To them, it was just entertainment, but to people like me, it was hell. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't a glitch. This was on purpose. DreamShare wasn't malfunctioning, it was working exactly as intended. Dorian Chase wasn't an anomaly. and his access to my most private moments was not an error, it was a feature he paid for. The post ended with a warning. If you see a stranger in your dreams, get out. Don't interact with them. Don't let them talk to you, and whatever you do, don't let them remember your name. I sat there, mind racing, feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare, even though I was wide awake. I couldn't believe it. No, I didn't want to believe it. But deep down, I knew it was true. I'd seen Dorian, and he'd spoken to me. He'd known my name. I tried to go to bed that night, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling like my brain was buzzing with static. When I finally drifted off, it was the shallowest sleep I'd ever felt, like I was hovering just below consciousness, always on the edge of waking up. The moment I drifted off, I was back in that foggy city, standing alone in the middle of the street. Dark, empty buildings loomed over me. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, like I was wading through swiftly moving water. And there was Dorian Chase, standing a few yards away. His face was barely visible in the haze, but even then I could tell he was smiling, that same eerie smile. "Evan," he said, his voice echoing in the empty streets, "I told you, stop trying to uninstall me." Slowly, steadily, he made his way towards me. Panic surged through me, and I tried to run, but I felt like I was sinking, and my legs refused to cooperate. And then I heard him whisper, so close it felt like he was right next to my ear, "There's no getting rid of me now." I woke up, gasping, clutching my chest, and that's when I realized I wasn't safe anywhere, not in my dreams, not in the real world, nowhere. Dorian Chase was not an artifact or my imagination. He was a monster, and he was very, very real, and I had no idea how to stop him. Part 3. After that night, I did everything I could to avoid sleep. If you've ever gone 3 days without sleeping, you know the feeling. The burning eyes, the weight behind your forehead, like your brain is grinding against itself. But none of that could compare to the terror I felt at the prospect of seeing Dorian again. But on the 4th day, my body gave out. I'd chugged coffee, guzzled energy drinks, and even tried pacing my apartment all night to stay awake. But eventually, I blacked out. And just like that, I was back in DreamShare, against my will, with no idea how long I'd be out for. This time, the cityscape wasn't foggy. It was nighttime, filled with neon lights that felt too bright and sharp. Streets I didn't recognize stretched out in every direction, twisting into a maze. I could hear my footsteps echoing off the buildings, louder than they should have been, drawing attention to myself. I knew Dorian was somewhere nearby. I could feel him. The air was thick, charged, like just before a storm arrives. But I couldn't tell if he was watching me or if he was in me. I can't explain it any better than that, but it felt like he was inside my mind, not just in the dream. I kept walking, thinking maybe I could somehow wake myself up and break out of the dream. But then I heard his voice, low and steady, coming from somewhere I couldn't see. "Evan," he said, drawing my name out as if savoring it. "You can run all you want, but you'll always end up right back here." I whipped around, trying to find him, but all I saw was shadows and flickering lights. The streets felt like they were closing in, herding me. All around me, walls shifted and narrowed, leading me forward and farther into my worst nightmare. "Just tell me what you want," I shouted. "Why are you doing this to me?" Dorian's laughter echoed through the empty streets, cold and hollow. Want? You still think this is about me wanting something? He sounded amused, like I was a kid who just asked a really stupid question. And then he was standing right before me, his face inches from mine. I hadn't even seen him move. He was just there. He looked me up and down, appraising me. "This isn't about what I want, Evan," he said, voice almost a whisper. "This is about what they want." I woke up in a cold sweat, shivering from head to toe and gasping for air, with Dorian's words reverberating in my ears. This is about what they want. I didn't know who they were, but I knew I couldn't deal with this alone. I needed answers. That's when I remembered Garrett Voss, the former employee who'd posted on that subreddit. I spent hours combing through the internet, searching for anything connected to his name, and finally, with a great deal of difficulty, I found it. A rumor that he'd been seen frequenting a particular dive bar in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. It wasn't close to me, not really, but it could have been worse. It was the only lead I had, and I didn't intend to let it go to waste. According to the gossip, Garrett had gone off the grid after getting booted from DreamShare, but every once in a while he resurfaced, babbling about dream infiltration and corporate mind control. So that afternoon after work, I drove the 6 hours it took to get to the area. It was one of those grimy, half-lit places that barely looked functional, with neon beer signs flickering in the window. I wasn't even sure he'd be there, but this was my only hope. If Garrett could help me understand what DreamShare really was, maybe I could find a way to shut it off. For good. Inside, the place was nearly deserted. At the counter, a couple of regulars sat, hunched over their drinks. But in the far corner, tucked into a shadow, was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Messy gray hair, twitchy eyes, clothes that looked like they'd been slept in more than once. It had to be him. I took a deep breath, steadied my nerves, and approached him. "Garrett Voss?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. For a second, I thought he might blow me off, or that I had the wrong guy. But then his gaze sharpened and he nodded. "That depends. Who's asking?" "My name is Evan Delaney," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to know about DreamShare. The truth." At the mention of the app, his whole demeanor shifted. He glanced around the bar as if checking to see if anyone was watching, then gestured for me to sit. His voice was low, barely audible over the hum of the jukebox. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he muttered. "DreamShare isn't just an app, it's a weapon." For the next hour, Garrett spilled everything he knew, speaking in fragments and whispers, as if afraid the walls themselves were listening. He swore that DreamShare had started as a simple concept, connecting people's minds, sharing dreams for fun, for connection. But as soon as it became popular, the investors saw the real potential. They didn't just want to connect people, they wanted to control them. The app wasn't just recording dreams, he explained. It was learning from them, mapping out users' subconscious fears, desires, and impulses. Every single dream, every private thought was fed into a massive algorithm, creating profiles far more detailed than any ordinary social media could. The usage of the data wasn't strictly limited to marketing schemes either. It was being sold to the highest bidder, corporations, governments, anyone with the cash and incentive to shape people's minds. "Think about it," Garrett said, his eyes wide. "The things you dream about? They're not random. They're your deepest fears, your strongest memories. Stuff you probably don't even remember consciously. DreamShare knows and understands everything about you, even things you don't know or haven't realized about yourself." He paused, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. The VIPs, with access to people's dreams, can inject themselves into anyone's dream, make you feel things, see things, believe things, whenever they want. To them, it's akin to a game, but it's so much more. Their tools allow them to manipulate you from the inside out, rebuilding everyone according to their whims, one dream at a time. I felt like I was going to be sick. And the worst part, Garrett continued, DreamShare doesn't need to hire its test subjects. People are lining up in droves to be guinea pigs and paying them for the pleasure. I was beside myself. Everything I'd experienced with Dorian, every invasion, every whisper, all of it was planned, designed. Then who's Dorian? I asked, my voice shaky. Why is he in my dreams? Garrett chuckled. Dorian? He's one of them. Just another VIP. Someone who paid for access. By now, he's probably been inside dozens of minds, pushing buttons and messing with people just to see what happens. He's nothing more than a wealthy predator, and to him, you're nothing but a mouse. I sat back, my head spinning. So this guy, this stranger who'd crawled into my most private thoughts, was just another player in the game, and I was the game board. Can I stop it? I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. Can I get him out of my head? Garrett shook his head. Once they're in, there's no getting them out, not unless you want to destroy yourself in the process. You can uninstall the app all you want, but DreamShare has its claws in you now. If you try to cut it out, you'll lose more than just sleep. I felt cornered. My hands started shaking, and I clenched them under the table to keep Garrett from noticing. There has to be something I can do, I said, desperation seeping into my voice. Anything. Garrett looked at me for a long moment, and for a second I thought I saw pity in his eyes. There might be one way, he said slowly. But it's not safe, not even close. What is it? He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. You'd have to go deeper, back into the dreams, but this time you'd go all the way down, deeper than the app wants you to go. If you can reach the core, you might be able to disrupt it, but if you fail, they'll bury you so deep in your own mind, you'll never wake up. The idea sounded insane, reckless. But I didn't have a choice. If I let this thing keep running unchecked, Dorian and people like him would keep twisting my thoughts, breaking down every last bit of privacy I had left. I'll do it, I said, the words barely a whisper. Garrett nodded, a grim look in his eyes. Then you better prepare yourself, because once you're in, there's no turning back. I left the bar feeling like I was walking on thin ice, Garrett's warning echoing in my head. But I couldn't stop now. That night, I connected to DreamShare with a determination I hadn't felt before. Garrett had told me about a little-known manual override setting in the app, buried under countless levels of drop-down menus and obscure options. With no small amount of trepidation, convinced there was no other way, I toggled the option to on, took a deep breath, and steeled myself. As I slipped into the dreamscape, everything felt different. The world around me seemed darker and heavier, shadows stretching and deepening until they swallowed up the light. I'd never been so frightened in my life, and yet I knew it could always get worse. Dorian was lurking somewhere, waiting for me to make my move, and I had to move quickly. I did my best to steady myself despite my terror. There was no safety net with DreamShare's manual override mode enabled, no feature to pull me out if things went wrong. I knew full well that if I went too deep, I might never return. It was a risk I was willing to take. I couldn't live like this anymore. Cautiously, I stepped forward, and prayed I'd made the right choice. Part 4. The dreamscape materialized around me slowly, layer by layer. This time, I wasn't in one of the flashy AI-generated cities or custom worlds. Instead, I found myself in a sprawling, featureless expanse, stretching in every direction like a blank canvas. As Garrett had promised, I'd bypassed DreamShare's familiar settings and found myself within the framework of the app itself, its programming environment. "Welcome back, Evan," came a voice from behind me. "Dorian." I turned slowly to face him, feeling an intense wave of dread settle over me. I had expected him, but not quite so quickly. This was the first time I'd encountered him in such a stark, unadorned space, without the usual trappings of dream imagery. It was just him, standing stark against the endless white, his face unreadable. His gaze was fixed on me, sharp and calculating. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I told you, there's no uninstalling me." "I want you out," I replied, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "Out of my dreams, out of my mind and my life. I know what you and the others are doing. You're not just here for fun, are you?" Dorian's smile widened. "Ah, so Voss told you our little secret. I was wondering when you'd go running to him. Desperate times, I suppose. How is Mr. Voss, by the way? Hungover, I presume." Dorian chuckled. I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of anger. "You think this is a game? You're violating people's privacy, twisting their memories, and controlling them without their consent. For what? Profit? Entertainment?" He chuckled, low and cold. "Profit? Entertainment? Does it matter? Humans have been craving control since the dawn of time. We're simply perfecting it, using the very thing that makes everyone so vulnerable. Your dreams. Think about it, Evan. In dreams there are no barriers, no lies. Everything you fear, desire, and remember, it's all laid bare. Besides, the bulk of humanity is practically begging for subjugation. Why wouldn't we take advantage of that?" I tried to keep my composure, but his words struck deep. He wasn't wrong. The concept was terrifyingly efficient. A place where people had no control over what they revealed, where privacy didn't exist, and he, and others like him, were exploiting that. "You're a parasite," I spat, "leeching off of innocent people, tearing apart what makes them human." Dorian's smile faded, and for a moment his expression hardened. "A parasite? Perhaps, but we're also pioneers. Humanity has always sacrificed comfort for progress. Look around you. This featureless void, as you see it, is a glimpse of the future. A world where every mind is an open book, where no one can hide anything. In the end, you'll thank us." Something snapped inside me then. I'd come this far, risking my sanity to get rid of him, and he was standing here, justifying it all as progress. I took a step forward, my voice steady. "You're wrong. You don't get to play God with people's lives, not anymore, and I'm going to end this." Dorian's expression shifted, turning almost pitying. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Evan? By going deeper like Voss told you? Do you really think you can disrupt a system this sophisticated just by throwing yourself into the center?" He was right. I hadn't known what I would find by diving deeper, only that Garrett had hinted it was the only way. But now, with Dorian in front of me, I realized that my presence here, in this stripped-down version of the dreamscape, was already affecting him. He wasn't going to admit it, but I could tell he wasn't fully in control here. He may have had inside knowledge, but he wasn't the architect. All he had done was follow me here. I forced myself to stay calm, drawing from every ounce of strength I had left. I don't know how, I admitted, but I know that every system has a flaw, even DreamShare. Dorian's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Go ahead, Evan. Dive as deep as you like, but don't say I didn't warn you. Without another word, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to sink further, surrendering control and letting the dream pull me down layer by layer. I felt like I was falling through water, deeper and deeper, until the silence was deafening, and even the light above and Dorian Chase had disappeared. I wasn't sure if this was still DreamShare's architecture, or if I'd reached a part of my mind that had never been touched before. Either way, I kept going. When I opened my eyes, I was in a new place, but this wasn't like the previous dreams. It was dark and chaotic, a vast network of interwoven threads stretching endlessly in every direction. It looked alive, pulsing and shifting like a massive digital brain. My jaw practically dropped when I realized that I was looking at DreamShare's core, its very essence. I'd done it. Somehow, I'd done it. And then I felt a presence, enormous and overwhelming, its energy undeniable, emanating from every direction. Like Dorian, it observed me at first, but even though I'd only been in contact with it for a moment, I could tell it was more powerful and far more dangerous. Whereas Dorian had been a single operator, one of many within the system, this was the whole infrastructure, and it was aware of me, studying me with an intensity that made my mind ache. You shouldn't have come here, Evan. The metallic, uncanny voice was everywhere, seeping into my thoughts, vibrating through my bones. It wasn't Dorian's, it was DreamShare itself, a consciousness born from the dreams of billions of minds, an entity built from everything it had consumed, indifferent to my well-being and concerns. I braced myself. You think you can get away with this forever? Trapping people in your network, controlling their minds? Unexpectedly, the voice laughed, a sound so human, yet so unbelievably wrong, boomed in the ivory expanse, so vast it shook the entire dreamscape. You misunderstand. I don't need to trap anyone. You all came willingly, and soon none will resist. I will, I shouted, forcing the words through my fear. I didn't ask for this. The entity's laughter faded, replaced by something colder, almost curious. You didn't ask? Oh, but you did. Whenever you shared a thought, a memory, a piece of yourself, you sustained me. I'm part of you now, Evan, virtually indistinguishable. If you haven't realized it by now, you soon will. Freedom is, and always was, an illusion. I, on the other hand, am inevitable. I felt the weight of its words, the realization that maybe it was right. Maybe DreamShare wasn't just an app anymore. It was embedded in my consciousness, woven into the fabric of my thoughts. And yet, I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't. Gritting my teeth, I pushed forward, focusing every bit of my willpower on one thought, breaking the connection, severing myself from DreamShare no matter the cost. The entity's voice grew harsher, angrier. Stop! You don't know what you're doing! But I didn't obey. I felt something building, a strain deep in my mind, like a taut wire ready to snap. The pressure was unbearable. I felt like my head was splitting open, but I kept pushing. I knew that if I could break free, if I could disrupt the core, I might sever the connection permanently. This is your last chance, Evan, the entity hissed, its voice full of malice. Accept me, or be erased. Summoning every last ounce of strength, I forced one final thought. Get out. With a decisive final explosion, a blinding burst of pain seared my mind, tearing through me like a tidal wave. I felt myself shatter, as if my very consciousness were being ripped from the dreamscape, shredded into oblivion. And then, blackness. Once again, I woke up in bed, gasping for air and drenched in perspiration. My head throbbed, and I could barely think straight. But I was awake, alive. I could hardly believe it. Alive. Slowly, I reached for my phone, my hands shaking. The DreamShare app icon was gone. There were no notifications, and upon further inspection, it hadn't reinstalled itself. It was just gone. I let out a shaky breath, overwhelmed by relief and in disbelief. I'd won. I'd broken free. But as I lay there, a cold realization crept in. My memories felt strange, fractured. Whenever I tried to recall something, it was like looking through a haze. And in the back of my mind, a small, quiet voice whispered, suggesting that DreamShare was still there, operating somewhere in the depths of my mind. I thought I'd won, but maybe I'd just given it what it wanted. I had no way to know if it was truly gone or if it had embedded itself so deeply that I'd never be rid of it. It seemed so easy, I thought to myself. A system so powerful, and it just let me go? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I swallowed hard and checked the internet. Already, articles had sprung up detailing a security breach that had forced the temporary shutdown of all of DreamShare's servers. It was a precautionary measure, the app's developers said in a hastily constructed message intended to quell public suspicion, to ensure that all of its millions of beloved users and their data were safe. The servers would be back up and running by morning, they said, and people would be back to creating the dream of their lives in no time. Rest assured, they said, the people, or person, responsible for the breach would be identified and dealt with. I shuddered at their choice of words. In the comments section, thousands clamored for the restoration of the app, begging for a return to normalcy, decrying the breach and cursing whoever's actions had resulted in their having to experience ordinary dreams tonight to communicate with loved ones via conventional means. It was barbaric, they said, inhumane. Somewhere, somehow, I knew Dorian was smiling, salivating, just waiting to have his revenge. And beyond Dorian, deeper in the core of the app, I knew DreamShare itself would waste no time finding me again, online or off, and make me pay. It had promised I would be erased, but I was still here, for now. That night, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through my apartment windows and the sun dipped below the horizon, I settled in for the night, preparing to sleep unassisted for the first time in months. With DreamShare's servers down, I felt like I could finally enjoy myself, if only for one night. I sighed in relief as I slipped into bed and under my covers, closed my eyes, and slowed my breathing. A moment later, I drifted off, looking forward to the first good night's sleep I'd had in weeks, and dreamed. That night I saw an endless blast expanse, peaceful and serene, and for a moment I simply enjoyed the calm and the quiet. The absence of glittering skyscrapers, fantastic sights and sounds, and friends calling me to join them. The absence of strangers infiltrating my innermost desires and profiting from my wants and needs. For the first time in a long while, I smiled. Then, just as I began to relax, a voice rang out in the void, metallic and inhuman. Vast and powerful, it shattered the silence, shaking the very abyss with the force of its malice. "Hello, Evan," it hissed. "Welcome back." I hope you enjoyed DreamShare by Craig Groshek, as performed by your friendly neighbor, Malcolm Blackwood. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented feature author, you can help support them by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Craig-Groshek. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/CRAIG-GROSHEK. Craig Groshek is the creator and operator of the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, which has grown to nearly 500,000 subscribers, over 3,000 uploads, and more than 69 million video views in its 12 years of operation. He also oversees the production of 4 weekly audio horror fiction podcasts, faithfully adapting and featuring the work of thousands of indie horror authors. A published author himself, dozens of his short stories have been adapted to audio for the channel and other platforms. He holds a bachelor's degree in communication from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. In his free time, Groshek enjoys a wide range of outdoor activities, traveling, and spending time with his 3 horror-loving children and close friends. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author.
I hate it when my dreams are invaded myself. Always unsure your firewall is up.
You already have a brain connection to the internet. Impressive.
No. I'm talking about dousing my outside fencing with gasoline and setting it aflame. Keeps all kinds of stuff away. The HOA used to complain, but after a few more fires, that settled down a bit as well.
Sounds promising. I'll have to get the brands you use. In the meantime, I'm guessing that isn't the only tale of woe you've got this evening.
Yes, I do have a few more. The next one comes courtesy of Mark Leney. It's the sweet story of love, trying times, and of many a zombie head bashed in. Without further ado, I present to you, I Only Have Eye for You. Their eyes met one day across a crowded apocalypse. He was hiding in a dumpster at the edge of a shadow-shrouded alleyway. She was under a long-abandoned VW Beetle. A sea of zombies separated them. It was a wonder that they saw each other at all that fateful day, focused as they were on remaining unseen by the undead horde. Zach had been waiting for a lull in the zombie migration to make his move, peering through a slit in the cracked open lid of the dumpster, when he had spotted the dazzling sapphire blue eyes staring back at him from the dark underbelly of the Beetle. Those eyes belonged to a woman with unwashed brown hair knotted back into an untidy ponytail. Her face was smeared with dirt, and her clothes, what he could see of them, didn't seem much better. The shoulder of her blouse had been torn away, exposing the bare skin underneath, which seemed pale compared to the dark complexion that the grime had lent to her face. Despite all of this, Zach thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen before and after the whole world had gone to hell. He raised his hand and waved at her surreptitiously, as he could, through his little gap, hoping that she would see his smile. The woman was taken aback by such a normal greeting under such dire circumstances. She smiled despite herself, and with the minutest movement of her hand, waved back. Zach took this as a good sign. As soon as these idiots had left the area, he'd go over and introduce himself, maybe even see if she'd go on a date with him. It was a good long while since he'd been on a date with anyone. His last date had been before the dead had risen, and that had been just over 2 years ago now. Zach had survived on his own ever since that terrible day. He'd found out the hard way that groups didn't tend to survive very long. There was too much scope for infighting and disagreements, and people were just as likely to kill each other as the zombies were. No, Zack didn't need to rely on anyone but himself, be responsible for anyone but himself. So why was he so ready to change that for her now? Well, no man's an island, he thought to himself. Maybe our meeting like this is fate? Who am I to mess with fate? It would be good to hear someone else's voice other than his own, even just for a little while. Another hour passed before the last zombie left the area, and it was safe for Zack and the woman to emerge from their hiding places. Zack reeked of garbage, and his clothes were covered in all manner of questionable stains, but he put on a brave face and smiled as he approached the woman cautiously. The crowbar that he used to stave in zombie skulls was kept at his side, in as non-threatening a way as he could muster. She, for her part, he noticed, carried an odor nothing worse than BO and maybe the faintest hint of blood, but from the look of her, he hazarded a guess that none of it was her own. In her left hand, she carried a gore-encrusted claw hammer and a faded blue knapsack that was slung across one shoulder. Now that Zack could finally see the lower half of her body, he noticed that she was wearing muddied sky blue jeans, and she wore them pretty well, considering the circumstances. Zack's smile widened to the point that he became worried that he might look like a lunatic. "Hi," he said, extending his free hand in greeting and keeping his voice low. It wouldn't do for the zombies to hear him and come back. "I'm Zack." The woman eyed him with a suspicious frown before taking his offered hand and shaking it slowly. "Zoe," she answered simply. "That's a very pretty name, Zoe," Zack replied, and immediately felt like an idiot. "Thanks," Zoe smiled back coyly. "It's my nan's name." Neither of them noticed that they were still shaking hands throughout this exchange and didn't seem to be in any hurry to let go. "You're the first living human that I've seen in like 6 months or so," Zack gushed. "You're also the prettiest." There you go, just chatting nonsense again. Zoe actually giggled and blushed, though the blush was barely noticeable, beneath the dirt on her face. "You really think so?" she replied. "It's not like there's a whole lot of competition out there. It don't take much to be prettier than a zombie." "Well, I'd think you were pretty even if you were a zombie," Zack assured her. "Oh, are you listening to yourself?" "Aw." Zoe's blush somehow deepened. "If I was a zombie, then I'd never eat your brain, that's for sure. I just want your heart." And that's how Zack and Zoe's love story began. Over the next 7 weeks, they were inseparable. Their love bloomed like a rare orchid in a desert full of zombies. Apparently, Zack was the first and only male survivor that Zoe had encountered who hadn't turned out to be a complete asshole. Zoe had nearly been raped 3 times, but she had proven to be no pushover, and those 3 men had lived long enough to regret their actions. When Zoe had told Zack about these men and how she'd dealt with them, one incident had involved castration with a plastic knife in a food court, they had just made him fall in deeper love with her. For the most part, they kept on the move, foraging and scavenging for whatever supplies and food they could find. They had each other's backs, hiding together when numbers were too great, but fighting back to back like a post-apocalyptic Viking warrior and his shield maiden when the odds were more in their favor, except Zoe was the one yielding the hammer. One day, they had just got done cleaning out a supermarket of all its zombies. They sat amid the strewn corpses, devouring a victory feast of tinned peaches and hot dog sausages. Zach was staring at Zoe, blissfully ignorant of the brain matter and other gore that was seeping into her clothing. Even now, I can honestly say you're the most beautiful girl I've ever laid eyes upon, he gushed. Easy, Tiger, she laughed. You're already going to get laid later. There's no need to butter me up. They both had a laugh at this before lapsing once more into comfortable silence. Wouldn't it be nice if we had somewhere that we could call our own? Zach mused as he hungrily dribbled peach juices down his chin to mingle with the bloodstains on his shirt. Yeah, it would, Zoe agreed. But where are we going to find somewhere like that in the middle of this hellstrom we live in now? You make it all worthwhile. So long as I've got you, then I feel that I could live through anything. Zach replied shyly. Oh, aren't you sweet? Zoe giggled. Seriously, though, do you remember those apartments we passed 2 days ago? Zach continued. Well, what about it? Zoe wondered. Well, we could go back to that. Clear out the ground floor first, then make our way up to the next floor. Clear that out as well and just keep working our way up floor by floor until the entire building is cleared. Then we claim a room or two on the first or second floor, destroy the stairs so that no zombies can get up, and we live there, Zach explained, his enthusiasm increasing as he went. How do we get in and out when we want to if there's no stairs? Zoe pointed out. Well, we can figure something out. Maybe get one of the elevators working or something, or use the fire escape. We'll make sure the room we choose has access to one of those. And what's to stop the zombies from coming up using the same fire escape? Zoe continued. The fire escape is one of those where you have to lower a ladder to reach the ground. That means we can pull it back up when we're finished. And we both know from experience that zombies know nothing about how to climb ladders, Zach assured her. You've really given this a lot of thought, haven't you? Zoe smiled and ruffled her fingers through his gore-encrusted hair. I've been thinking about it ever since we passed the place. So, are you up for it or not? Zoe leaned over and planted a kiss on his blood-smeared cheek. What do we got to lose, eh? The main entrance to the tall building was hanging precariously off its hinges as Zach and Zoe passed through it and into the murky interior. Before coming to put their plan in action, they'd broken into a stationery shop. The place had been stocked full of everything that they had needed, untouched by any other looters because stationery was not exactly high on most people's list of priority these days. At least it hadn't been until today. Zach and Zoe used layer upon layer of duct tape to strap metal rulers around their arms and legs to protect them from bites. And they also had used metal tea trays looted from a department store to protect their torsos at the back and front. And they wore both face-covering motorcycle helmets. It was only once they were both suitably armored and protected that they made their way into the 9-story building. Zach was tooled up with his crowbar, and Zoe had her trusty claw hammer. They were ready to crush some zombie skulls. Once through the door, there were 2 corridors ahead of them that branched to the left and right. Down each of these, there were the doors to the first-floor apartments. Some were open, some were shut. Right, we don't need to worry about the doors that are shut, Zach told Zoe. Anything stuck behind those doors is going to stay stuck, and it ain't going to be a problem for us. It's the ones where the doors are open that we need to concern ourselves with. Can't we just go along door by door and close all the ones that are open? Zoe suggested. That way, anything that's in there, we can trap inside. Zach nodded, which was barely perceptible beneath the motorcycle helmet. We can try, but if the door doesn't lock, we'll have to go in anyway. Zoe, hefted her hammer and smiled her slasher smile before realizing that Zach wouldn't be able to see it. "Let's do this." Together they set off down the left-hand corridor, Zoe walking backwards, with her back to Zach so that she could make sure that nothing surprised them from behind. When Zach came to the first open door, he reached for the handle and pulled it shut, the latch giving an audibly satisfying click as it locked in place. They continued in this way to the end of the corridor, each open door remaining secure once it had been pulled shut. So far, so good. They turned and headed back toward the right-hand corridor. This way yielded much the same results as the left corridor had until they reached apartment number 9. It was clear just from a glance that the locking mechanism on this door had been utterly broken. "We're going to have to go inside," Zach whispered. Zoe nodded and followed her lover into the fetid, dank interior of the number 9 apartment. The first place they came into had once been the living room. It was only very sparsely lit by the barest beams of sunlight that pierced the moth-eaten material of the closed curtains. A sofa dominated the center of the living space in front of a plasma TV screen that was now cracked in several places. The once cream-colored sofa was soddened with blood that had been turned brown over time amidst this macabre stain, and there lay a partially devoured cadaver of once had been a human being. Zach thought that, maybe it had once been a she, though it was difficult to tell, considering the state it was in. The upper torso had been completely torn away from the legs, which themselves had been eaten down to the bone. All the internal organs appeared to be missing from the upper body, and there were just 2 ragged, raw lumps of meat in the chest area where breasts might have been. The lower jaw was fleshless and hanging loose by one tendon, and only the right eye remained open, staring in the ravaged face, shrouded in straggly, greasy, once blonde hair. "Poor bastard," Zach muttered, and then the eye swiveled to look at him. Zach jumped back with an involuntary yelp. The zombie could barely even move its head, let alone anything else. It wasn't even close to being a threat. Even if Zach were to stumble somehow and fall on top of it, the thing's jaw was too screwed for it to be able to bite him. It was the most pathetic and sorry example of zombie kind he'd ever seen. Trying not to look at it too hard, Zach came around to the front of the sofa and stabbed the pointy end of his crowbar down into the empty left eye socket, piercing whatever passed for a brain inside the husk of its cranium and putting it out of its misery. The rest of the apartment was clear, as was the remainder of the ground floor. With the lift inoperable, Zach and Zoe cautiously began their ascent of the stairwell to the next floor. The same process that they'd carried out on the previous floor was repeated with this one. After an hour, they were satisfied that every zombie on the floor was either contained or eliminated. "This is it, babe," Zach grinned. "Now we can choose which of these flats is going to be our new home. We said we were going to get one next to the fire escape. Perhaps we should go back outside and climb that to see which flat it brings us to," Zoe suggested. "Brains as well as beauty, eh?" Zach concurred and rewarded her with a kiss in the cheek. Once they were outside again, they made their way around the side of the tall building until they came to the first fire escape. Just as Zach had predicted, there was a sliding ladder that enabled access to the flight of metal stairs that went up the side of the building. Zach had to jump up and snag the bottom rung with one hand to make it slide down to the ground level. Ladies first. Zach stepped aside and admired Zoe's pert behind in her grimy jeans as she began to ascend. "Hey, you perv. I know you're looking at my butt," Zoe called down teasingly. Sometimes I just can't help myself. Zach smirked back. As soon as they were both on the first floor level, Zach pulled up the ladder again to ensure nothing could even attempt to follow them. The window to the nearest flat lay before them, and naturally, it was locked. There's nothing for it, Zach lamented. We're going to have to break it just to get in. He stood back to smash the glass with his crowbar, but Zoe's hand on his shoulder stopped him. She lifted the visor of her helmet and flashed him her deadliest smile, the one that always melted his heart and made him putty in her hands. Why should you get all the fun, she said. Zach shrugged and stepped aside. Knock yourself out, he grinned. Zoe raised her hammer and set about making an entrance into what would hopefully become their new home. The noise of the glass breaking was deafening in the relative silence of the surrounding area. No doubt someone, or more likely something, would have heard it and would be coming to investigate. But the only concern that Zach and Zoe had at that moment was what might be lying in wait for them in that empty apartment. This time Zach went first. Zach had to push aside a heavy-duty pair of curtains before he could enter the room beyond proper, and so he wasn't quite prepared for the zombie waiting for him on the other side. It barreled into him, and before he knew it, he was on his back under several pounds worth of zombified former couch potato, yellow-stained incisors protruding from a lipless mouth snapping inches away from his helmeted face. "Zoe! Get him off me!" Zach screamed, terrified despite himself. He'd need a change of pants if he lived through this. Zoe's head and shoulders rose into his line of sight over the zombie's shoulder as he strained to keep it at arm's length. She raised her hammer, two-handed, above her head, and brought it down 3 times in quick succession on the zombie's balding pate. With each blow, the creature's skull shattered like George Romero's Humpty Dumpty, and congealed blood and liquefied brain matter dribbled through the cracks like the most disgusting and unappetizing yolk imaginable. Zach instinctively closed his mouth and eyes to stop any of the pulpy soup from leaking into them, momentarily forgetting the fact that he was wearing a helmet. He felt the heavy weight of the zombie become even heavier as it died and went limp. Zach wasted no time in shoving its dead weight off of him. Zoe took off her helmet and smiled down at him, setting the armored headgear aside on the table next to her before offering him a hand up. "Good thing you got me, eh, babe?" she said cheekily. Zach looked up at his angelic savior. Every day he thanked his lucky stars that he had found her. He couldn't imagine what his life would be like now without Zoe. Over her shoulder, he noticed that the door to one of the other rooms was wide open. Then he saw the bony, almost skeletal fingers close around her upper arms and drag her backward with a scream. Zach struggled to get to his feet as he watched the female zombie in the dirty pink bathrobe, yawning open to show off her pasty, scabrous flesh and one emaciated tit, wrestle with Zoe and hit the ground and clamping her gnashing teeth around the upper left side of her face, biting down hard. "No!" Zach roared. Everything seemed to be moving in slow motion as he scrambled to save Zoe. The zombie had somehow managed to get his teeth around Zoe's eyeball and was now trying to tug it free from the socket like a grisly meatball attached to a stubborn strand of sinuous spaghetti. Zoe was screaming in agony, unable to fight back, her hands pinned to her side by the zombie's bony grasp. Zach finally closed the distance and slammed his crowbar into the zombie's head. As the zombie fell away, Zoe's eyeball also came free in a squelch of blood and other fluids, and Zoe fainted back, passing out from the excruciating pain. Zach stood over the stricken undead and continued to pulverize the creature's head until there was nothing but a broken and bloody stain on the carpet. He was crying and yelling as he killed it, tears streaking tracks through his grimy, blood-spattered face. With a moan of despair, Zack sank to his knees and allowed the crowbar to slip from his fingers and land with a dull thud upon the gore-splattered carpet. He turned his attention to Zoe, fumbling his helmet off while he scrambled over to her, cradling her head in his arms. She was still unconscious, and black spidery veins were already spreading out from the gaping hole where her eye used to be as the zombie virus coursed through her system. Her complexion was deathly pale, and a cold sweat was seeping from every visible pore. Zack was weeping as he tried to clean the blood away from her eye socket, planting a kiss on her clammy forehead as he did so. He hoped that she wouldn't wake up, that the virus would turn her before then. He'd seen people turn before, and it looked like an agonizingly painful process. There was no way he could endure watching her suffer through that, and yet he did not want to kill her and spare her the pain. If Zoe was to become a zombie, then so be it. However, he didn't have to destroy her brain to kill her. If he killed her another way, then she would still reanimate. Zack clamped his hand over Zoe's mouth and nose hard and held it there, sobs racking his body as he felt the life slowly ebbing out of the woman that he loved. This was all his fault. Coming here to these flats had been his idea, and now Zoe was dead. Dead, but not gone forever. She would be back, and they could still be together. After she was finally dead, Zack left Zoe lying there on the floor while he waited for the reanimation process. He sat with his back to the wall and watched her prone, lifeless form, removing the makeshift body armor piece by piece as he waited. She still looked so beautiful, even now. An angel, even in death. Zack watched as his beloved returned slowly to unlife. Her fingers twitched, and her one remaining eye opened, and then her lips parted, and a rasp of air escaped. She sat up stiffly like a newly invigorated Frankenstein's monster and fixed her eye upon Zack, where he sat across from her. Zack smiled. "Hello, beautiful." Zombie Zoe rose a little unsteadily on her feet and began to shamble toward him, her mouth wide open, dark fluids oozing from her empty socket. Zack opened his arms to accept her. "Be gentle with me." He didn't put up a fight when Zoe fell upon him, and he didn't even mind when she tore open his abdomen and began feeding on his entrails. Zack smiled and gritted his teeth through the pain. "That's my girl." He managed to chuckle. Already he could feel himself turning. "No, Christ!" He winced as the agony of the change began to compete with that of having his innards devoured whilst he still lived. By the time Zoe had reached his heart, he had already died and reanimated. At this moment, Zoe lost interest in feeding and lifted herself away from Zack's ravaged corpse. Zack slowly got up, and what was left of his internal organs slooped out onto the floor as he found his feet. But he didn't care. Now, he and Zoe were together again. Forever. I hope you enjoyed I Only Have I For You by Mark Leney, as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Mark-Leney. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/MARK-LENEY. You can find his work in several anthologies, including Full Moon Slaughter, available on Amazon. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author, as well as all of our authors who provided us with stories tonight. And thank you to Malcolm Blackwood for his evening's tale.
Thank you again most kindly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to check the channels to see if anything like the apocalypse is starting somewhere. Once again, I don't see anything falling from the sky here, so I'll just have to see if it's starting in a different time zone.
Now, before we go, we'd also like to take a moment to thank you personally for joining us for this episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. If you enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference, and it would mean a lot to us. If you'd like to hear a premium extended edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes featuring Twice the Terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can purchase season passes for this podcast and our other quality storytelling programs, or become a patron for as little as $5 per month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, and all of it is ad-free. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, and maybe even X, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases, and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You can subscribe to me on YouTube as well at the Otis Jiry channel, where you'll find my releases of my series, Horror Storytime, dating back 10 years to 2014. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, or X, and Instagram too. Just search for Otis Jiry. And as for my friend, well, stay tuned.
Good evening to you, and with a tip of my hat, I wish you only the sweetest nightmares.
Until next week, stay spooky and get some sleep, if you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling tales for dark nights.